Hello and welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. It's been just over 2 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, and what some thought could be a short fight has seemingly turned into a grinding war of attrition and atrocities. Joining us to talk about where we are right now 2 months into the invasion from the BGSU Department of Political Science are Dr. Neal Jesse and Dr. Marc Simon, the chair and professor in that department, and from the Department of Media and Communications, Dr. Gorsevski. I want to welcome you all to Journal again, and thanks for coming back. We were here a month or so ago, about a month in. We're now 2 months in, and Dr. Jesse, kind of bring us up to speed on what's happened in this last month from the last time we talked.
Well, last time we talked, the war was just beginning, and Russia had some ambitious plans. It appeared that they were bombarding major cities across Ukraine. They had troops entering from Belarus, troops entering from Crimea and Russia. And it appeared that they were trying to knock out the Ukrainian government. They failed in this, and as we all know from watching the news. And now Russia is recentering their efforts on the south and the east of Ukraine. In particular, attempting to seize the Donbas region, which they had invaded in 2014, and trying to link up that territory with Crimea by basically taking the coast of Ukraine down along the south all the way to the peninsula of Crimea. So Russia now has more limited aims than they had before. The Russian government understands that they really are not going to subdue all of Ukraine, that they're unlikely to take out the Ukrainian government, and as such, Putin is attempting to find some way to portray this as a victory back in Russia. And there are good strategic reasons for these particular aims. If he can link up Crimea with the eastern part of Ukraine, which of course borders Russia, then he will have gained territory that allows him to dominate the seas there and allows his military, and particularly his navy, to then operate freely. The difficulty, of course, is that the Ukrainian government and military has been rebuilding this entire time. So we're likely to see a long war now in which Ukraine will find it very difficult to displace these Russian units, because unlike what happened near Kiev, where Russian units were a long ways away from their supply lines. Units operating in the east, units operating near Crimea are directly connected to Russian supply. So Russia can hold out in a defensive position for a very long time. So we're probably entering a war of attrition at this point, in which the two may end up in a stalemate similar to what happened after 2014. But again, there's a lot of other scenarios that could happen as well.
And as the Russian military, because I know we talked the last time, their performance wasn't what we typically have perceived them to be. Have they, because they've now pulled back, is this because they haven't been successful? They've tried to regroup and limit their objectives now? Is that really what's going on?
That's exactly what has occurred. Their infantry, their armor units in particular, militarized battalions, have been very ineffective on the attack. And their bombardment techniques, though, which they used successfully, in Grozny before, they've used it in Syria, they used it here in Ukraine over and over, are effective. So they're able to hold defensive positions and shell cities and reduce cities to the ground. So what the gains that Russia has made in the east are likely to be defensible, by the Russians. But yeah, they're unlikely to go on any more offensives across Ukraine because the military is fairly ineffective at that. And while they did a new conscription to get more units into the military, and while they have reinforced a number of their battalions that are in the area, we shouldn't see any offensive action from Russia anymore.
I wonder if I could jump in.
Sure, yeah.
One of the things we find in political science research is interesting, because Neal's explaining why the Russian military performed way less effectively than we expected. And it turns out that dictatorships often have this problem. There's an old finding that democracies fight or tend to win the wars they fight. And part of that is because, in Russia's a perfect case of this, it's really a corrupt dictatorship. The corruption goes through the military, and so you get things that, for instance, people want to tell the leader what they want to hear, but there's a lot of stealing going on. So, there were situations where trucks and artillery were offloaded onto Ukrainian territory and their tires didn't work, and things just broke down. So I think that what ended up happening to Russia partly is their failure was that they had what we call a ghost army. Looked good on paper, but because there had been a lot of stealing going on and not a lot of honesty up the chain of the command, they weren't prepared for a real fight in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, and the messaging, and I know we talked the last time about Zelensky versus Putin. Has that changed? How is that playing out now, 30 days downstream from the last time we talked?
Right, yeah. Putin and the Russian media really have had a difficult time trying to catch up because Zelensky has this very charismatic, star charisma and appeal that really comes through on camera. He comes across as very immediate, like you're FaceTiming with a friend holding up his cell phone. So he has just this great ability to emote, and that has translated into great support for the Ukrainian people and for the Ukrainian military. Now, this past week, the U.S. has approved, billions of dollars worth of military aid. And also, there have been some major image events in terms of the Ukrainians being able to sink one of the pride jewels of the Russian warships, the Moskva, which the Ukrainians then, very plucky, they created a stamp, a memorial commemorative stamp with a soldier flipping the bird to the sinking Moskva. So they've done these sort of image events and harnessed this sort of younger millennial style, Gen Z style social media campaign, which has been quite successאבל.
Yeah. And from their perspective too, they have the good message. They're defending their land. The Russians
They're the
are the
underdogs.
invaders. So but he, as you said, he's extremely good at making sure that message gets through. And Putin, on the other hand, has struggled because of the failures of the military, because it wasn't a slam dunk. Hey, we're in and we're out of here, and we accomplished what we wanted. He hasn't been nearly as good at his message.
No, he's come across as very stuffy and stodgy, in these highly ornate, fancy, Kremlin drawing rooms across these ridiculously long tables, so it looks like a Saturday Night Live skit. There have been memes poking fun at that, so they did a sort of IKEA style called the Putin table, which is extremely long. So, he just really hasn't been able to compete in terms of messaging, despite the fact that the Russians have instituted and very heavily enforced this ban on talking about anything other than the peacekeeping operation that the Kremlin prefers to call this. Or limited military operation. They have different euphemisms for it. But yeah, his messaging has just not been successful.
Okay. Well, when we come back, obviously we've got a lot more to talk about, and where we see this heading in the next, however long it's going to be. Back in just a moment, we're talking about the situation in Ukraine with faculty members from Bowling Green State University, Neal Jesse from Political Science, Marc Simon, Political Science, and Ellen Gorsevski from Media and Communications. Back in just a moment on The Journal. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. We're talking about Ukraine, and our guests are Neal Jesse, Ellen Gorsevski, and Marc Simon. And I know, Marc, you wanted to kind of jump in at the end of that last segment, so pick up where we left off.
Yeah, well, Ellen mentioned the sinking of this battleship, which, I think I'm curious about the messaging from that as well. But militarily, this was a really badly handled situation. While it's possible to sink a battleship with shoulder-launched, missiles and things like this, most countries have all kinds of precautions that they take to keep that from happening. And so Russia just didn't do a good job. And then when they initially messaged it, I don't know, for me that had echoes of the sort of communist eras, like, we had fire on ship, it was no missiles, no problem. And then they have to admit later that, oh yeah, it was hit and it was sunk by these Neptune missiles.
Yeah, and they showed purportedly people from the ship in a row meeting with, I think it was Putin, was it? And apparently that was footage that we later found out was lifted from an earlier event. So again, just very much a mismatch between reality and the portrayals
Well,
of disinformation.
And the actual sinking of the missile cruiser Moskva this should never have happened. You know, this is another sign of the lack of preparation and training by the Russian Navy. By all indications, Ukraine and Western intelligence have been tracking it for 2 weeks. They had been moving back and forth across the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea unescorted. And you know, it's the primary missile defense and anti-aircraft defense of the Black Sea Fleet, and it's there to protect other ships from getting hit by these sorts of missiles. And you know, the Ukrainians sent out a number of drones, the Turkish drones, in order to draw the defenses away of the ship, and then struck it with the Neptune missiles. The thing is, this would not happen to an American ship, right? It would have other ships around it to protect it from these sorts of attacks, and that it was moving unescorted. It just shows that the Russian fleet is as lacking in its training, in its preparation, in its just basic operations, you know, as the rest of the military. And so this was not only, you know, a symbolic downing, but realistically the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet, because now the rest of the fleet is parking so far off the Ukrainian coast that they're ineffective. And again shows, you know, as Ellen and Mark were talking about, you know, the rot at the center of the Russian government leads to the rest of these problems. You know, this last couple of weeks, the defense minister Sergei Shoigu has gone missing. He apparently had a heart attack. He's been seen since, but he does not appear to be in complete control of his facilities. Valery Gerasimov, he's the head of the general staff, who came up with the Gerasimov Doctrine, which was one of the strategic plans to invade Ukraine in 2014. He is all of a sudden now sidelined. And so one of the great difficulties Putin is having is not only is his messaging poor, but he's removing a good portion of the people who would actually be operationally in charge of this war. And we're seeing him making replacements at the top level. This is only going to make the matters worse for Russia. You know, that it's similar to Stalin's purges, and that you're removing a lot of people who are capable of doing things on top of a military that's already fairly incapable. We would likely not see the Russian military turn around in its operations and get more effective, probably for at least another month or so, you know, as they try to reorganize. But yeah, the sinking of the Moskva is a good example of just how poor the Russian military really is.
Well, and I think you referred to it, Mark, and you said it reminds you of the old days of communism, where the message can be totally unreflective of what really happened, and yet they're going to try and sell it. And that's and the same thing with the purge, the Stalin purge of the Red Army before in the 30s, before World War II, and then when the Germans arrived, there were people there who didn't really know how to operate a military operation.
And an analogy for what's going on right now too might be the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. You know, where the Baltic fleet sailed all the way out of the Baltics, across the Atlantic, down underneath Africa, back through the Indian Ocean, up through the Pacific into
the sea,
the Sea of Japan, and then got sunk. And realistically, the Tsar's army was about as ineffective as today's Russian army is. Very little has changed, and as you know, as Marc Simon has said, a lot of the reasons for this is the Russian system of government is still just as corrupt.
And yet, Mark, the nuclear saber rattling is very concerning. And
it is. I want to come to that, but I was going to also mention that what's interesting is that the Russian government still is able to tell its own people what it wants them to hear, and so the international messaging is really bad for Russia, but internally they still control things. And that is part of the scary thing about any nuclear saber rattling that's going on. I mean, I think Putin is now in a point where he's not boxed in to the point where I was worried a month ago that he might actually use nuclear weapons to prevent embarrassing withdrawal from the Kyiv region and his broader aims. But he's done that now, and he's withdrawn from there, and he's focusing on the more, as Neal said, more limited aims. So there's less need for him to cross that nuclear threshold. But he keeps reminding the West that they have nuclear weapons. He launched a ballistic missile test. That's just, again, to remember that we have these weapons. The problem that we have to worry about with Putin is not just accidents, but when he gets in trouble, he really has nowhere else to go but escalation. And at some point, there's enough Russian military doctrine about using what they would call small tactical nuclear weapons in limited strikes. But once we cross that threshold, we don't know what can happen. So I am concerned.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because, once you open that door, okay, well, we've used a tactical nuclear weapon. Well, we might as well, then the next step is, well, that didn't work. We got to go bigger. We got to keep going bigger, and then eventually you might get to something. Yeah.
But the outrage that that's going to create, will there be a lot of pressure on the West, the United States mainly, but NATO in general, to retaliate with some kind of nuclear response. And once we go there, no one ever figured this out in the Cold War, how to keep that limited, how to keep that from going to, nuclear weapons being launched between the two continents and the US and Russian cities being destroyed. So that's a really slippery slope, or at least it's one we don't know how to navigate, and I hope we don't go there. But it does look to me like the fact that Russia limited its goals now means that they're less backed into a corner than they were.
Okay. Well, we come back, we can kind of pick it up. And the other question I had, and we can think about this, once whatever line is, with stop line is, whatever happens, how does Ukraine rebuild from all of this? We come back, because they've been, there's some pretty devastating things that have gone on. So back in just a moment, we're talking about Ukraine here on The Journal. Back in just a second. Thanks for staying with us on The Journal. We're talking about Ukraine. We talked with the group we have here today, Neal Jesse, Gorsevski, and Marc Simon, about a month ago, and we're now another month into what some people thought would be a really short war. I know, Ellen, you wanted to talk a little bit about, again, some of the imaging and the perceptions and things of that nature, so why don't you lead off with that?
Right, so as if it weren't bad enough for the Russians that they had to completely give up on the Kiev region, now they're mounting mass graves and evidence of, if not war crimes, then UN definitions of actions of aggression as sort of the slightly lesser war crimes of murdering civilians. And so procedures from the United Nations to The Hague are being put into place to begin to investigate those and prosecute those. So things just keep getting worse and worse for the Russians in terms of the Ukrainians looking like the beleaguered underdogs, and the Russians, really looking awful. And
I don't want to denigrate or dismiss the idea that Russia's committed war crimes, because it's obvious that they have, and I think that's one of the benefits of what's been going on through the UN, is at least they're doing some monitoring and gathering all that information. But I do want to mention that it is war, and there are atrocities on both sides.
On both sides,
and
yes.
you're going to hear that played up every time Russia can. Now there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there too, which Russia promotes to try to, like this idea that somehow there's a chemical or biological weapons plant in Ukraine that's going to be used against Russia. I mean, what Russia's incentive and most aggressors do is they try to create this sense of victimhood, that somehow there's a big conspiracy that the West is really trying to use Ukraine to dismantle Russia and attack Russia with chemical weapons and all this.
All right.
But that's why we have a UN system and why we have an international criminal court and things like that, so that there are organizations that can objectively collect a lot of evidence and get to the bottom of this. It's just hard to do during the war. We find out a whole lot more after it all ends.
Yeah, Bucha is really the, what some believe to be the tip of the iceberg in terms of problems, agreed, including on both sides.
Yeah. And while we know that Putin may or may not be Stalin, I mean, it is, but there are similarities that develop, and of course, World War II, you had the mass killings of Polish army officers, which the Russians tried to pin on the Germans tried to pin it on the Russians, and it turned out we knew it had been the Russians all along, but of course they were our ally at that point, so we couldn't say anything. And the mention of the UN, is there a place for the UN to intervene on the ground there, as maybe they did during the Balkan Wars in Serbia and Croatia, or is this a totally different situation?
The United Nations is designed so that the 5 veto powers in the Security Council, Russia, the US, Britain, France, and China, have more power than everybody else.
Right.
And whenever those countries' interests are not served by the UN, they will veto the Security Council
Yes.
resolution. Therefore, the UN can't do much of anything as far as putting peacekeepers on the ground and things like that. So it's only when those 5 countries can cooperate.
And Zelensky has, implored the UN to remove Russia, if not permanently, at least temporarily, but
That's not
realistically,
not going to happen.
Well, in fact, that's the design of
doubt
the
it.
United Nations, is for that very reason. We want it to be a universal organization. The League of Nations did not include all the major powers, the United States being the obvious one. The UN is going to include all the major powers, and if we don't give them special privileges like this, they will leave, right? I mean, if right now there wasn't a veto and the UN intervened in this conflict, Russia would probably leave the UN.
Well, this is one of the interesting things about this conflict is we know that countries that were not part of NATO were invaded by Russia, Georgia, Ukraine. It's one reason why Sweden, Finland, and others are trying to get into NATO, one reason why the Baltic nations got into NATO. But we also see here, as Ellen and Mark are talking about, that Russia effectively has neutralized the United Nations as a peacekeeping force, or as a force that can intervene in this particular conflict. And this isn't lost on Putin. This is one reason why Ukraine was particularly vulnerable and was such a target back in 2014 and also now, is because there will be no intervention. Because they're not part of NATO, NATO will not intervene militarily. The UN cannot intervene. So it really is a war between Russia and Ukraine that Russia is got the initiative on and continues to try and maintain the initiative. But as you're saying, Zelensky is doing such a good job of trying to get the initiative and world's attention on the Ukrainian plight. And in some way then that will be a way in which Ukraine can get international support along with the funding that they get for the military in order to take the initiative away from Putin and back him into a corner.
Yeah, Zelensky just appeared, yet again at the Venice Biennale, their major arts exhibition, and so, he was imploring the world community to. They have a special exhibition on Ukrainian photography, documenting the horrors of the war. So the PR offensive of Zelensky has just been really quite remarkable and unstoppable. And media critics have noted the double standard in portrayals because the Rohingya or the Tigrayans in Ethiopia have not received the coverage that the Ukrainians have. So there have been observations by media moguls like Saadi, a major media owner in Afghanistan, has pointed out, he saw Charlie D'Agata on CBS saying, oh, well, unlike Afghanistan or Iraq, this was a peaceful nation. And the Afghani media person said, no, we were peaceful too before the Soviets and then the Americans invaded. So, there have been critics who have pointed that out as well.
And it is a good point because, and at the same time, it's starting to drift back in the news cycle now a little bit. It's not the leads. It's not one of the top 3 stories every night. It's fallen unless something dramatic. Not the rest. It's not all dramatic.
The story
but
fatigue.
Unless something is really, really out of the ordinary now. The day-to-day grinding war doesn't attract the media's attention the way it did a month ago.
And I hate to say though, is the way the Russian military performs and operates is that we're likely to see them doing a lot of damage to cities, and basically, even if they end up withdrawing and losing, leaving Ukraine as a pretty destroyed country, and it's going to look a lot like Germany after World War II, just lots of rubble, and that's because that's what they can do. They can bomb from a distance, but they can't actually occupy and control that country. They also want to make sure that Ukraine doesn't ever look like a successful alternative to a Russian system. I think that was one of the motives that Putin had from the very beginning, was that, hey, if Ukraine shifts more toward Europe, becomes democratic, and and offers an alternative, then the Russian people might want that.
I completely agree. That was one of the motives, and in order, one reason for this war was to create a more compliant country, on the border with Russia, and not let it turn Western, and
be successful.
Exactly,
Right.
and I agree
So-
that destruction of the economy of Ukraine is an aim of this particular war. And but for instance, what Russia gets out of this, though, is also quite as limited. The amount of destruction that they've done in the Donbass region and around Mariupol and others means that what they're going to gain in that land bridge is basically just a conduit to move troops into Crimea. But it's equally going to be as destroyed. So they're inflicting losses on themselves here as well with this strategy of aerial bombardment.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to. I'll give you. You've got 15 seconds. I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I just think that the continued optics are still in Ukraine's favor over Russia. Despite sort of the realpolitik is coming across quite differently to your average, Western news observer.
Okay. We're gonna have to leave it there this time. And I know the last time we talked, we knew there were hours and hours about this we could go into, and we'll probably be back again in another 4 or 5 weeks to talk more about it. I want to thank you guys for being here again today. Appreciate you coming on and lending your expertise about this and explore some of the things that may not get attention in the nightly newscasts and be a little more in depth. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and of course you can watch us every Thursday night at 8 p.m. on the Journal. We will see you again next time. Good night and good luck.